Well, hello, my name is Jim Royal. I'm a huge Beatles and Elvis Presley fan and basically classic rock in general. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. If you could do a thumbs up, that's always most appreciated. And feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy reading them and I do my best to try to respond in a timely manner. Today what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about a rare Paul McCartney release. If you're a Beatle fan or a Paul McCartney fan and you like to collect his records, this is something I definitely recommend. It is part of his official discography. It is called the McCartney Interview. Now, while this album might be out of print, it is easily available on auction sites like eBay. Very reasonably priced. This particular record came out on the Parlophone label back on December 4th, 1980 in the UK, and then on the Columbia Records label, which was a label he was with here in the States, it came out in 1981. And this is a Columbia version of it right here. It says specially priced limited collector's edition. Nice Price was always a budget one that Columbia had, and as I can see here, they paid $5.49 for it. This is the photography done on here is done by Linda McCartney. Nice picture, I really like the cover. And then here's the back side, and it's still on the shrink as you can see. And then we've got the McCartney Interview Complete. This was a 54-minute interview. He was promoting a new album, McCartney II, and this was recorded May of 1980. The journalist named Vic Garabani was the person who interviewed him, and he worked for Musician and Listener and Player magazines. And later, a written account of this, of most of the interview, was published in the August 1980 issue of Musician magazine. So, and if I'm not mistaken, copies that were given to radio stations actually included that in there. That's what I've read. Now, the other reason I wanted to talk about this, besides just how great this interview was, is I also have a 2-disc version of it as well. And I don't know if it's authorized or if it's actually a bootleg. So that's what I want to ask you, because on that it says demonstration not for sale. And I'll show that to you in just a moment. So the thing about Paul McCartney interviews and what makes this so special is normally Paul is very scripted. He's been doing this for years and years and years. He's asked the same questions over and over again. And it's not that, you know, he has the same stories. So it just sounds like he's just saying the same thing over and over again. At this point he wasn't. Okay? In fact, you know, many people, you know, reporters and stuff at the time, they were very skeptical, you know, that, you know, with this interview that at the beginning, because they said the ex-Beatles were notoriously reluctant to talk about their time together. But in McCartney's London office where this was recorded, it was really laid back and casual but fast-paced. Paul finally decided that afternoon to break what he called the voodoo against talking about the Beatles. And what's also interesting about this is, you know, you hear the interviewer, it's a complete, so you hear him talking to Paul. And it says that these tapes were not meant to be released, but Columbia liked, you know, what they saw, what they were hearing. They thought it would be a good promotion for Paul. It was being done really for, you know, the magazine. And they decided to release it to the general public also, and that's why we have this. But in these recordings, you hear it says, what does it say? English, police sirens, wandering children, slamming doors, Paul preparing tea, intermittent giggling from the interviewer, and McCartney's tendency to use the microphone as a snare drum, which I thought was pretty funny. So let me show you the 2-disc. Let me put this over here, and then I'll show you the 2-disc. Alright, so this is my 2-disc. I got this about a month ago. So it's not a gatefold or anything like that. But anyway, this is it. You can see a little more of the collar pronounced on there than, you know, what you could on the other one. And then this is the back side. So what you have is here is you have album 1, you have, just like the one I showed you, the complete side 1 and side 2, and then album 2, it says banded excerpts. So the whole idea is that if a radio station wants to just hear Paul and not the interviewer discussing, answering something, this is just Paul, it's edited, okay? And let me show you, and this was interesting too, because what you got here on the label, you've got nothing written on these, so that's why I also am not really sure. What you do have is you have something in the inner wax. It says OBS1A to signify that's the front side, and then you've got on this one, you've got OBS1B, and then so forth for the other. So here's the other record. There you go. Okay. So, yeah, what do you guys think? Do you think this is legit? Do you think this is an actual promo copy? Maybe a special limited edition, even more limited? I don't know. I've never heard anything about it. But briefly, let me tell you about what he talks about in here, okay? Oh, I wanted to tell you too on here, if with the side B, if you listen to the last part of it, you listen to the last, right at the, right when the record ends and the needle is getting ready to lift, the EMI engineers, as a clue for, for Paul and everything, all the Beatles stuff, what they said is, you play the outgroove backwards, Paul says, I'm still a walrus, because that is actually what he says in the interview. Alright, so in it he talks about McCartney II. He was promoting the new album. He talks about how that album came about. He rented equipment from the studio to record, just fool around, record some songs at home. He did all the instruments on it and the vocals. I think Linda might have helped a little bit, but just with the vocals, if anything. So he rented it out for 2 weeks, and then he checked it, he renewed it another 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks. So he had 6 weeks. He said the first 3 songs were instrumentals. He said he just was having a fun time. He was doing something different than what he normally does, and he just did it for himself. Then after that, someone got wind, he was doing it. They listened to the songs, and they said, oh, this is your next album, huh? He was still with Wings, by the way. And he says, yeah, I guess it is, and they liked it. So then he said that's when, it got serious, and some of the fun was kind of gone because he had to take it serious. And this is the cool thing, too, because John Lennon was still alive then. This was May of 1980, and that's the thing that also makes it magic, too. Listening to him at this time, just the hope that him and the Beatles, all of them could still be back together. Negative criticism of the Beatles and Wings, talks about that. He talks about his influences. Venus and Mars, this was interesting. So he says that he didn't like Venus and Mars. I am just shocked. I thought Venus and Mars was an excellent Wings album. But he says that he didn't really like it more until he went to a party, and I guess they were playing the album. People at the party, and then he saw how much they were enjoying it, and he appreciated it more. He talked about Wildlife and how not everything he does is going to be a big hit. He would like it to be, but he says that's not why he's doing everything. Wildlife was inspired by Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan had an album where he worked on, he went to the studio and recorded the album in 1 week. And Wildlife was recorded in 2, very raw, just like that one. Band on the Run. He said this was more or less a solo effort. He had Denny Laine, who was with Wings, and Linda McCartney, but the other 2 members bailed on him the night, he said, just within a few hours when they were supposed to go to Africa to record this new album. And that was the drummer and the guitarist left. And then he talked about the musical direction. He specifically talks about Ringo, and he says, with Ringo, he says, everything, that he basically, they told him what to play. It was their song, so they didn't just let him play whatever he wanted. They told him how they wanted it. I was like, wow. Then he says, even John said that. He says it was a John song. He would say, this is how I want the drums to go. And then he talks about George, how George is a fine guitarist and one of the best. And he says he felt embarrassed, but with the song Hey Jude, he tells the story how George wanted to accent guitar notes after the end of, like Hey Jude, da 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 da, don't make it bad, da 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 da, and he didn't want that. So he had to put his foot down to that. The interviewer asked him, what was like, one of your most tense albums? And he said, The White Album, and he said there were a lot of tension there. It was a long, drawn out. It was a double album, many months. He says people were moving in there and they moved beds in there. And then he talked about Helter Skelter, how that was inspired by a Pete Townsend song. To basically, Pete Townsend talked about, I believe it was I Can See for Miles, how he wanted a heavy sound. And then, Paul was inspired to do a heavier sound. Talked about Abbey Road. He says, well, the interviewer said that must have been, tense too. He says, it was at time. There were a few moments, but he says overall he really enjoyed that album. He enjoyed really making, the second half, side B, the medley. And then he talked about his musical background and, how he, played trumpet first and how he had issues with his lip, so he gave that up. He says you can't sing and play trumpet at the same time, so he didn't want to do that. And then how he took up guitar and piano. And then finally, how he stumbled into learning bass in Hamburg because his guitar fell apart. He kept trying to keep it together and it just finally gave up. So then he started learning bass. Early influences, mixes, Motown and Stax influences. He talks about, the story of the Sgt. Pepper story, how that was inspired by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Then the interviewer asked him about Rubber Soul and Revolver, how, that was really, those were really good periods for the Beatles, and he agrees, but he also thinks there were other periods too that were really good. Fame and success for Paul and John's reaction. I thought this was interesting. So what he talks about here is he says how he says, when we first had that, that song on the radio, that #1 hit, and you get fame. This, he was talking about himself, very open during this whole thing, and just amazing. He says, it's very exciting, very happy. You just want to sign autograph upon autograph, just keep going and going. But then he says after 3 or 4 years, that wears off, and you get tired of doing it. You get tired of what comes along with fame. But he says, you know what? He's at a moment right now where he likes doing autographs again, and that was 1980. So I just thought that was kind of cool how he said that. Stage fright during the Beatles and Wings. He talks about how Wings started. He says the new wave and the early Beatles. He's talking about the music of the day and the punk music, how it's basically the same thing. It had the same raw energy that the Beatles did. It's just different music. Not only the raw energy, but that everyone shared. In concert. They were on the stage. And then creating the Beatles sound, Love Me Do, and early songs. So he says that him and John wrote about 50 songs, early on. He says the only thing that really came out of that was Love Me Do. He says, though, he does have notebooks with the other songs. And then the second half, the second disc, talks about the Beatles' conquest of America. He says, we were prepared. We had our image, we had our dress, we had good people around us, the roadies, Mel and stuff, and Neil, good management. We were ready for it. We practiced, we had albums, we were ready for it. Beatles, haircuts, and image. This was interesting. This was the idea that, he said this was like, I believe he said art students and then people in Germany, that he was inspired by, and they were. And it just became Beatles because the Beatles made it popular. Paying dues in Hamburg and Liverpool, early tours. He says we played 8 hours a day. He says we treated it like a job, like a full-time job, unlike some of the other groups. And they were determined, to make it big. And that's where they got their skill. They honed their craft. Weathering pressures and the breakup. What he says that there were various reasons, but he says that one of those reasons was Yoko. He says John found Yoko and they were very happy for him, but he says before it was just the four of them and, doing everything. And Beatles' wives and girlfriends just weren't at the studio, and now you've got her there all the time. And, that definitely put some pressure on them, among other things. the video of Coming Up, I thought this was fun and reliving the Beatle image. So if you watch the Coming Up, which was a #1 song from this album, it shows, you know, Paul and Linda playing all the musicians in the group that, you know, in this performing this song. They have Buddy Holly in there, that's Paul. And then they said, well, who's going to play the you know, who are we going to get to, you know, who are you going to impersonate for the bass? He says, how about Beatle Paul? So he wore his old Beatle Paul outfit, and he got his old bass, which still, he says, is an antique now because it's got the set list and everything. You know, he was pretty cool, excited about it. And he says afterwards, people were so happy, they asked for his autograph, you know, on the set. That was kind of neat. Playing bass, he talks about that. Lennon-McCartney's songwriting and dislike of formula. He talks about Beatle imitators, how a lot of his friends were, you know, their friends were different groups and how they faded away. And, you know, he just felt bad for them, but that's what they did. I Am the Walrus, he talked about ELO and the I Am Walrus connection, the Black Carnation, Sgt. Pepper LP cover. You know, he talked about that. New Wave, Bowie, Ferry. Brian Ferry. Okay, so David Bowie, Brian Ferry, and Elvis Costello. You know, the music of the day. And then he talked about pop music and radio. He talked about, I like pop music. He says, I like to write pop music. I like to listen to it. And I like radio. If it's good radio, it's hard to come by, but, you know, I do like good radio stations. And then finally, he talked about getting married and changing perspective, and how Waterfalls was more or less written, you know, for not wanting your love to do crazy things and die, because then, you know, you're left alone. And then finally, Give Ireland Back to the Irish, political song, how it was banned, Hi Hi Hi, sexual innuendos, rock and roll, that was banned. And then children's songs like Mary Had a Little Lamb. He says, I write grown-up songs and I write children's songs too. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to leave comments. Thank you.